Now we'll get into the process of risk management. This is a fairly typical process of risk management. You'll see it in many textbooks. There's a few variations of this, but it's not right. They're not usually radically different than that. We're going to use a slightly different template that's much simpler. Our template's going to be the find, measure, mitigate, but that's in this process. Just this process is a little bit wordier. But the first thing, if you're trying to manage risk for an organization or for yourself personally, the first thing you start with is, why does this organization exist? Or what is this person trying to accomplish in their lives? What are the goals? So risk management must be coordinated with the mission of the organization. If you're doing something that doesn't directly tie to your mission and it's risky, you should probably stop doing it. We talked about ValueJet in the last session. ValueJet went out of business because they took on a risk that wasn't closely related to their core business, and it was risky, and when it blew up, it destroyed the entire business. So you start there. Why do we exist? Once you know why you exist, then you start assessing what can go wrong. And you do that in 3 steps: risk identification, risk analysis, and risk measurement. We'll be doing some risk measurement. That's what our next Excel application is all about. So risk identification is you're trying to look for perils, those things that can harm you, and exposures, those things that can be harmed. So a peril can be external, like a hurricane, like you're worried about your house. A hurricane could be a peril, and your exposure is the house. So the perils, what can go wrong, and the exposure, what's get hurt. It's an asset. An asset can fall in value, or liability can rise in value. So that's the peril side. The perils can be external, they can be internal. So an employee can be both a peril and an exposure. So an employee can be not following procedures, doing something risky, and they injure themselves and other employees. So you think in terms of perils not having to be external forces, but perils, whether they're external or internal to the company. And then exposures are those things that cause loss. Asset values falling, liability price values going up. Then you do risk analysis. What risk analysis is looking at how do perils and exposures interact such that you have a loss. So you're essentially going through kind of a roadmap or a diagram or something, or even just in your mind, just visualize the risk. So the risk can be a hurricane. The hurricane comes to your house, it knocks the roof off, knocks the wall down, but it also might cause a flooding. And you look at your homeowner's insurance only covers the wind damage, doesn't cover the water damage. And you say, well, wait a minute. As I go through this scenario in my mind, I'm not covered for every risk that I could face. I'm only covered for wind damage. What am I going to do about the water damage? And that's when you start looking at flood insurance instead of just homeowner's insurance. So you walk through the entire scenario, and that's what risk analysis is. It's trying to understand, and really, risk analysis works the best if you go through the extremes. Think about major events. So the peril might be your Exxon and oil prices fall. Well, assume they fall like they did here recently, 50% in just a very short period of time. And what does that do to your business? Obviously, it reduces the value of your energy reserves. Obviously, your income is going to be lower. You think through that. If you have Valero, then boy, oil prices fall. That reduces your input because you're buying oil and refining it to gasoline. But then because of COVID-19, people aren't driving. People are driving 20, 30, 40% less than they were. That's going to directly affect you. So you think through these scenarios and try to get a sense of how bad it could be, because you don't want to do risk management that only covers you for 3% losses, but then doesn't cover if you have 10% losses, if 10% losses are possible. So that's when we get into risk measurement. Risk management is all about frequency and severity. The probability that will happen, and when it happens, how much will you lose? So you're looking at the world of finance. We'll be looking at how finance does this using value at risk, which is a really popular tool. But frequency and severity apply everywhere. Cybersecurity, marketing, accounting. You want to think about what are those events that aren't likely to happen, but they could happen, and then when they happen, they could cause really large losses. And then we'll think about mitigation. What can we do to try to reduce or eliminate those losses. So expected loss is frequency times severity. So if you own a car and you have a 0.5% chance of totaling your car, and your car is worth $30,000 and your expected loss is 0.005, which is the same thing as 0.5%, times 30,000, frequency times severity, that's $150. That's the least your insurance company is going to charge you. They're going to add profit to that, some other things, but they say in the next 6 months, you're likely, there's a 0.5% chance that you'll do major damage to your car, and your car is worth $30,000. Then they'll start off charging you $150, then they might add $25 for expenses and add $25 for profit. So we're going to be talking about valued risk. The way we're going to express valued risk is we're not going to express it as an expected loss. Instead, we're going to say the valued risk at 0.5%, because that's your probability of totaling your car, is $30,000. So that means you have an expected loss of $30,000 at a 0.5% probability. So expected loss is just frequency times severity. That helps you know how much you might have to pay to insure that risk. VAR at 0.5% is the actual loss. So the 0.5 is the probability. The valued risk is the severity. So valued risk is the severity of that probability. We'll be doing some practice with valued risk, especially doing some of the doing the Excel application and getting some practice. So mission statement, risk analysis and assessment, and then you get the mitigation. Now that you know what your risks are, how do you mitigate them? So you start off with risk control, and risk control has 3 activities: risk avoidance, risk prevention, and risk reduction. Risk avoidance is you completely get rid of the risk. So let's say I got here an example of a pool. I got 3 examples of a pool. Let's say I have a pool in the backyard and you're worried about a neighborhood kid drowning in the pool. A risk avoidance would be you fill in the pool with concrete. So the risk of a child drowning in the pool is now 0. Now the kid could still come over and fall and scrape their knee on the concrete, but you're talking about the specific risk of a child drowning in your pool. If you fill the pool in with concrete, that risk completely goes away. You've avoided the risk. Risk prevention focuses on frequency. So you're not going to take the frequency down to 0, but you want to reduce it when you're closer to 0. So you'll put a tall fence around your pool. Or you talk about compliance procedures, types of things. Those things that try to keep the risk from happening. You won't get it to 0. You put a fence around the pool, there's still a chance a neighborhood kid will climb the fence and could still drown. But then if you're sued and they take you to court, part of your defense was, hey, we had a fence around the pool, we weren't negligent. So even if the child does drown, you may not, I know it'd be a terrible thing, but you may not have to pay for it, because the judge may rule that because you had a fence around the pool, you weren't negligent. But at least reduces the probability of happening, and that's what you're trying to do. Risk reduction is maybe you learn CPR. So if a child gets into your backyard, gets into the pool, and you're at home a lot, and you look back there every once in a while, or maybe you have some kind of warning system that tells you that someone's back there, and that goes off, you go back and you see the kid has jumped in and has drowned. As long as you're back there frequently and you can catch them before they've been back there too long, you know CPR, then maybe you can save their life. I'm not sure that's a very effective treatment, but with risk reduction, the risk has already happened. The kid's already back there. He's already fallen in the water. He's already, had water in his lungs or whatever. The risk has already happened, so you're trying to reduce the severity. Tylenol is a good example of that. When Tylenol, we talked about them having their product tampered with. They use public relations, so the risk has already happened. Their product has already been tampered with, so they're practicing risk reduction. That's public relations to try to get the loss lower so they don't destroy the company, they don't lose a really good product. Leave options out. I'm not going to talk. I do consider options to be part of this, and I love options. We just don't have enough time in this class to get into options. And then at the very end, if you can't mitigate the risk, then with the residual risk, you try to find the partner. So you do risk financing. This is where insurance comes in. Buying auto insurance is not risk avoidance. That's risk financing. So you buy auto insurance from State Farm, you can still have a risk and you still have a loss, especially if if you have an auto accident and it's your fault, and it happens to happen the same day that State Farm goes insolvent, then you haven't avoided the risk. It's come right back to you. You still got to pay for it because your insurance company is insolvent. So hiring someone else to insure a risk is not risk avoidance, it's risk financing. So insurance is risk financing. These are your residual risks. Residual risks are those risks that you still have after you practice risk control or loss control. You hear it as loss control or risk control. There are some strange scenarios that we won't talk about. Self-insuring through captives, risk securitization. USAA was really big in that. If you take my property and casualty class, we talk about risk securitization, letters of credit. There's several ways, but insurance is the main one I want you to think about with risk financing. Risk retention is the last thing you do, as you say, you know what? It's risky to run a business. We're going to have some risk we just have to take. We can't insure them. There's no insurance for that risk. We just have to take those risks and try to manage them as best that we can. So that's the typical process. Our goal in this process is not risk minimization. Our goal is risk optimization. We want to take risks for which we're very expertise at, where we're getting paid to take those risks. We want to eliminate or reduce risks that we don't get paid for or for we don't have expertise. Risk minimization is when you just try to take risks down to zero. Well, if you're an airline, then you eliminate your risk by just not flying planes anymore. Obviously, your risk goes to zero, but you're not going to make any money either. So if you're an airline, you're going to have to take the risk that one of your planes is going to crash. There's no way to avoid that. You can't practice risk avoidance. You can insure it, but you can't. The way you minimize is by just stop flying. So that doesn't make sense. So every business has some risk that they're going to retain. They're just going to take on. But you want to make sure those biggest risks that you're retaining are the ones you're getting compensated for and you really know how to manage. All right, so what we're going to take is this approach: risk identification, risk measurement, risk control. We're going to do it in this format. Define the risk, that's the risk identification. Measure the risk, and mitigate the risk. That's the risk control, and really includes risk financing. So define is where you talk about the peril and the exposure. Measure is where you talk about frequency and severity. And mitigate is where you use loss control or risk transfer. Let me show you on risk identification, a lot of firms have a universal risk. Let me show you one. CMRA is one of my favorite firms. Excellent firm. Right with their website up here. And they have a universal risk. And here's their universal risk. It looks a little bizarre. There's probably some things in here. Let me go back. I don't know why they kicked me out of that. There's probably some things in here. They say this is a partial listing. Some of the things in here that will make a lot of sense to you. Reputational risk, that makes a lot of sense. Political risk. Market risk, that's just the risk that stock prices fall or bond prices fall. Trying to find some easier one. Legal risk, that's the risk that you get sued or that your contract gets thrown out in court. Contagion risk, that's the risk that just exactly what we're going through right now with COVID-19. That's the risk that the whole system falls, the whole system crashes. I don't know if you noticed over here, one of the books that they brought up was the Jorian book that I mentioned with Orange County. This right here. So Jorian, he has other books out there on value risk. We're going to talk about value risk. But anyway, so there's some normal ones in here, and there's some unusual ones in here. Haircut risk. That's what does that mean? That sounds like something people are going through right now with COVID-19 because they can't get their hair cut or get their hair colored, but that's not what she means. Haircut risk is you set aside some money for a rainy day. So you say, let's set aside $10 million. That'll be our haircut. We'll set that aside. We won't spend that for a rainy day. And then the rainy day comes and it's $47 million. And you only set aside $10 million. Your haircut, you didn't put enough aside. I don't know why it's called a haircut. I guess you're cutting a little bit of your profit off and setting it aside. I just don't know about that. But there's some other headline risks. It's just that some employee in your company does something really stupid and it causes a harm to the entire organization. But anyway, there's a bunch of different risks in here. Interesting. This firm is started by Leslie Rawl. This is Leslie Rawl. One thing I'd strongly recommend to you, if you start a business and you put your picture on the website, change your picture every year. She's had this picture out there for a good 30, 40 years. So you don't want to shock people when they see you. Because same thing, Glenn Holton, he had the same problem for a while where he had the exact same picture out there for over 20 years. He finally updated his picture, so he looked more like he did. So that's the only complaint I could have about her. But I remember meeting her in New York City, and I was scared to say anything. I had never met someone as smart. Just talking to her, I could tell, wow, this is a brilliant person, one of the smartest people in finance. What her firm does is when a firm like Lehman Brothers or Orange County or Long-Term Capital Management, when they go under, this is the firm they hire to try to see what they can salvage. Because these firms, Lehman Brothers, Merrill Lynch, they're doing such complicated things. No average person can walk in and figure out what this firm is doing. And so that's why I can say this is an extremely brilliant person. She started a firm with another person named Barbara. I forget Barbara's last name. Barbara's not at the firm anymore. This gentleman, Peter, came in, and I've never met this person. But I met Leslie and Barbara, and I was just, boy, I was scared to say a word. I didn't want them to think I was stupid if I asked a stupid question. I was still pretty young into my career. This would be a great firm to work for, but you'd have to have a strong, strong math background, quantitative background to work for a firm like this. She probably has some degrees in quantitative applied mathematics, but so yeah, there's firms out there that do risk management. That's what capital market risk, you can see risk is in their title, capital market risk advisors does. So that's a universal risk. USAA has a universal risk. I don't like USAA's. It's probably over 100 items now, and some items make no sense to me at all. One of the items in their risk was net worth risk. Well, think about a universal risk. We're talking about perils, things that can cause you harm. When was the last time your net worth caused you harm? So net worth is the exposure. Net worth is what you lose when stock markets fall or bond markets fall or real estate prices fall. So I think some of their universal risk was actually exposures and not perils. So I didn't like that risk, that list. But anyway, if you take my risk management class, we walk through several risks, even more than these. We're going to walk through some of these. We'll see how much time we have. We'll focus on 3 of them. We may not be able to get through all 3 of these. We'll try to, but we'll definitely get through price risk. Price risk is the one where we use value at risk. We'll define it. We'll measure it using value at risk. But I'm going to talk about these other items. And then we're going to mitigate it using correlation and risk budgets. We're mainly going to focus on risk budgets, but I do want to talk about correlation and diversification. This is important because value at risk is closely related to standard deviation. We've already seen beta, but we'll talk a little bit about standard deviation. Hopefully you remember that from your statistics class. But value at risk, we're going to be doing parametric value at risk, which uses standard deviation, so it keeps it fairly simple. But value at risk is still one of the most used tools in finance. If you go into Goldman Sachs's or Morgan Stanley's or Citibank's or JP Morgan's annual report, they will definitely talk a lot about value at risk. We're not going to talk duration and convexity here. That's what you use for interest rate risk. So we're going to skip that in this class. We may talk a little bit about duration, and we'll see when we get into valuing bonds. If you take my investment class and my risk management class, we talk a lot about especially duration, but also duration and convexity. So we're going to focus our efforts on value at risk, but I do want to just make sure to remind you about standard deviation and what it is. So next session, we'll start here with how do we define price risk. You notice it says price risk / market risk. You'll see it either way. Some people call it price risk, some people call it market. Market risk is probably the more common term, but I'll probably switch between the 2 of them. But we'll get into that, and then the next session well, I don't know, either the next session or the first part of the next class, we'll definitely be doing the value at risk exercise.